The Jim Crow laws were state and local laws introduced in the southern United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to enforce racial segregation. The term Jim Crow was a derogatory term for an African American and originated from a theater character that was designed to mock a stereotypical African American. Racism towards African Americans stemmed from the transatlantic slave trade, where Africans were transported from West Africa to North America to raise cotton, sugarcane, and tobacco. Jim Crow laws enforced segregation, which was the legally enforced separation of African Americans from whites. From the late 1870s, Southern state legislatures passed laws requiring the separation of whites from Black Americans in public transportation and schools. These Jim Crow laws were extended to parks, cemeteries, theaters, and restaurants to prevent any contact between whites and blacks. While Jim Crow laws mainly referred to physical separation, they also applied to preventing marriages between white and Black Americans. Jim Crow laws were upheld in 1896 in the case of Plessy and Ferguson, in which the United States Supreme Court laid out its separate but equal legal doctrine. This meant that while African Americans could use the same facilities as white Americans, they were to be used separately, and the two groups of people could not mix. While the U.S. court held that these facilities were equal, facilities for African Americans were often run down and worse than their white counterparts. Drinking fountains, buses, and waiting rooms were significantly worse than those designed for white Americans. In some situations, there were no facilities for the Black community at all. Jim Crow laws institutionalized economic, political, and social disadvantages for most African Americans living in the United States. Companion laws excluded almost all African Americans from the right to vote in the South and deprived them of any representation in government. During the mid-1900s, Jim Crow laws began to wane. In 1954, segregation of public schools was declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court in the landmark case Brown and Board of Education. In some states, it took many years to implement this decision, while the Warren Court continued to rule against Jim Crow legislation in other cases such as Heart of Atlanta Motel, Inc. v. United States. The remaining Jim Crow laws were overturned by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, where discrimination was prohibited based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin.